Congressman, I want to transition to everybody's favorite subject these days, spending money. We're really good at that lately. The former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, was quoted in saying that the most significant threat to our national security is our debt. And there have been unprecedented federal spending levels over the past couple of months in response to the pandemic that we're facing. How much of that has already been appropriated? How much of it has already been spent at this point?
Yeah, so really good question. So appropriated is closing in on $3 trillion. Separate from that, the Fed has really grown Federal Reserve has really grown their balance sheet. And I think when you say $3 trillion, frankly, that's phase 1, 2, 3, 3.5, as it was called, kind of the bonus payroll protection plan, 25 billion additional for testing and 75 billion additional for hospitals. So what does that all amount to? Well, a lot of it's money that was for unemployment insurance. We knew there would be millions of people that would be unemployed based off of the planned response to COVID-19. And we also knew that you'd want to try to make people whole, not just the normal unemployment program. They kind of overdid it. They're paying some people more to be unemployed than they were to work. But their fundamentally goal was to keep people solvent. In a situation where the government's effectively closing the economy, I think you have a moral responsibility to keep people solvent. People didn't really save or price in the idea that the government would literally close the economy. In most states, all 50 states had a disaster declaration, and varying ranges of closure across the 50 states, which is rational because you had varying levels of threat from this virus. But a lot of the response has been the federal government has to step in and do this. Part of that was the payroll protection program, where essentially the government knew the unemployment system would be overloaded. And so the goal was to put cash through businesses to keep as many people as possible on payroll. You see that combination has resulted in over 33 million Americans unemployed now, and millions more helped to stay on the job via the payroll protection plan. So you think about it, our U.S. GDP, essentially sales for America, are about $23 trillion a year, about $1.8 trillion a month on average. So we're essentially putting that money back into the economy to bridge the impact on GDP. And we're saying we're borrowing it, but that's really not true. There's not really a lender. No one's lending us the money. It's effectively printed. And so when you print the money, ultimately that undermines the value of it, right? So that's what happens in failed states, frankly. But right now, that's what's happening in the vast majority of developed economies in the world. So the last time the planet had this much debt was World War II. And so you coming out of World War II, that's really, since then, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency. We kind of restructured the global monetary system with the Bretton Woods Agreement. Post that, we went to kind of the petrodollar and a different basis for it. But the US is the dominant currency, the reserve currency. In a time of stress, people around the world wanted to hold US dollars, not even their own currencies. And one of the real threats to the United States, if we continue this kind of printing of money in an unlimited fashion or overly expansive fashion, is you undermine the ability of the US dollar to stay the world's reserve currency. And there is going to be a lot of pressure after this, no matter what, to kind of look at the global monetary system. I mean, in the immediacy of it, it's sort of like World War II. You spend enough to win, right? You don't want to spend more than it takes to win, but you want to win, and you want to win quickly. Mm-hmm. And I think right now people are really wrestling with this. They're saying, we have to protect public health, and to do that, a vaccine, in the best case scenario, vaccines, treatments, anything else, the best case scenario is about a year out. And then you look over at the spending level and you say, can we really print an entire year worth of GDP? And so far, the vast majority of people I speak with agree rationally we can't print an entire year of GDP, $23 trillion. Mm-hmm. So somewhere in between now and $23 trillion is where we're framing the debate. And I think we do have to turn off the spending. Even Mitch McConnell reached his point and said, we probably have to turn off some of the spending. And the pressure right now is to kind of fund state and municipal governments. And, they're certainly disrupted by COVID-19. They've had lots of expenses, but their biggest is they're losing revenue because their economies are closed. Mm-hmm. The federal government's already spent $765 billion sending it to states. So, that we shouldn't lose sight of. $765 billion already to states is a big deal. So hopefully that gets at some of the highlights of what you're looking for on the spending.
Absolutely. I want to dig into that a little bit more, what you just said about the states. There have been some recent calls from Congress to bail out individual states. So how would this new bailout for states and local communities impact the national deficit, the total debt of our nation? And really, why should people care about this? Why does it matter?
Well, I think it really matters for one way to illustrate it is, look, we all know that the U.S. budget has been, bad for a long time. The amount of spending has been irresponsible for a long time, and largely because Congress can't agree on what to spend less money on. And in spite of the rhetoric around taxes, we were actually collecting more taxes after tax cuts than we were collecting before we did tax cuts, because it grew the economy, it grew the tax base, and so the rate of growth of revenue was going up at a rate of about 3%. Unfortunately, spending was growing at more than twice that rate. So now spending is massively outpacing revenue growth because of the impact on the economy. If you look at the states, most of them have balanced budget requirements in their states. But states like Ohio have done reforms and built a rainy day fund. And in our state, we spend less than 6% of our budget on public employee pensions, right? You care for your public employees, you want them to have good benefits and all that. But in Ohio, that means we spend less than 6% on pensions. And we've done major reforms so that we could fully fund the Ohio pension obligations. But if you look at Illinois as an example, the worst case scenario, they spend 58% of their budget on pensions. Now, they don't fully fund that 58%, but that's their obligation, it's 58%. And so when you don't fully fund a pension, it's akin to fraud, right? I mean, you're promising new benefits to people, but you're not really reserving to fund them. And, being in the federal government, we shouldn't throw stones. The federal government hasn't fully funded Social Security, Medicare, the Highway Trust Fund, any number of those things. And those are under stress. So as you start looking at, but we have to help Illinois or we have to help New York, think about your own state and say, why should Ohio, for example, fund pensions in Illinois? I mean, we care about it, but I think that's where we should go to, where the federal government only funds states and the political subdivisions of states, municipalities, colleges, all the other righteous causes are handled at the state level, because states did have different responses, but they've had different responses all along. So if we were going to give money to the states, it should be on a per electoral vote basis, per capita basis, and then let the states prioritize what they spend the money on. But in the mix, I think before we spend another dollar, we should really understand how the $765 billion that has already been sent to states is being used. And for the most part, you simply need to allow a little more flexibility on using the funds, largely because the public health threat from COVID-19 hasn't been nearly as big as everyone anticipated.
We walked into this situation, and a lot of the work that's been done is a direct, in direct response to helping the people who need it the most, kind of alleviate that hurting that they're feeling in the pocketbook. But going back to the Admiral Mullen quote about national security, are you worried about how significant federal spending, if we continue down this path, significant federal spending and debt are going to impact our country's ability just to respond to future crises like we're facing now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've used that quote myself many times because I don't find the fiscal path the United States has been on sustainable, right? I mean, before this, the plan was we were going to borrow $1 trillion. And, we've been able to borrow, most of the time, borrow the full $1 trillion that we want to borrow, right? So, and we can do that mostly because the US dollar is the global reserve currency. But it's important to remember that deficits do matter. There are people in both parties that have convinced themselves that deficits don't matter. And that's how they've continued to support this, crazy level of spending pre-COVID-19. And the example I always point out is the Soviet Union recently proved, a generation ago now, proved that deficits do matter. And how did they prove it? They bankrupted their country. It wasn't Chapter 7, like they're gone. They're kind of restructured, different look, shape, everything else. But the Russians are back there. They've clawed their way back onto the world stage. But unlike when I was back in high school and over in Germany and the Berlin Wall was up, we no longer think of the Soviet Union as a real near peer to the United States. They're not, because they went bankrupt. So bankrupt nations have a hard time defending themselves. And so the United States should really tread cautiously with this kind of spending. Not only will it hurt if we bankrupt our country, but if we lose our status as the world's reserve currency, a lot of the way we've kept the peace is through sanctions. OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, can do that because the US dollar being the reserve currency means most foreign transactions eventually flow through a US bank. So that helps us find terrorists. It helps us track all of the threats to our country in a way that would be much harder without that status.